Why does God seem so present sometimes in our lives, but not at others? Welcome to Theology Sabbath School, a ministry of the School of Theology on the campus of Walla Walla University. I'm Carl Cosart, the Dean of the School of Theology and the host of Theology Sabbath School. Today we're continuing in our study on the book of Acts entitled The Spirit and the Church, the Faith of the Earliest Christians. And we've come down to two really fascinating chapters. I mean, every chapter in Acts is fascinating, but these two chapters, chapters 11 and 12, are full of some amazing stories of God's interaction in the life of the early Christians in the book of Acts. And to help me look at these chapters, I've invited my friend, my colleague, and my boss, John McVeigh, president of Walla Walla University. So John, welcome to Theology Sabbath School. We're glad you're with us, and these are some great chapters. But I should ask, as I always do, how's your courage this time of year?
Well, it's been a challenging, busy week, but in the midst of all the decisions and the issues, I've certainly felt the Lord's blessing upon Walla Walla University.
They're there all the time, and His blessings are new every morning. He works in amazing ways. We don't always see those in some of the individual moments of time, but God's hand certainly is at work. And I think that is the theme of these chapters we're looking at. And these chapters take us back to some of the earliest days of the ministry of the Apostle Paul. And it starts with some fascinating stories with this church in Antioch. And so, John, I'm curious if you can kind of flesh out for us this church of Antioch. Paul's connected to it. What's that connection, and how is this church involved with some novel, intriguing, new evangelistic ideas?
Well, here, in chapter 11 of Acts, verses 19 through 30, at least for the moment, skipping over the Cornelius story, which Luke tells 3 times in the book of Acts in some 7 scenes plus an echo. So it gets a lot of press in the book of Acts. But moving to the vignette about the church in Antioch, it's a fascinating sketch of early church life, isn't it? And what goes on there. So we learn that there's an innovation that occurs. Now we have to be a little careful here because this is the 4th in 5 vignettes about the expansion of the Christian mission into the Gentile world. But the way that occurs here is that you have some people of Cyprus and Cyrene, or maybe you pronounce it Cyrene, but I think it's Cyrene, right?
You're the boss, so yes, it's Cyrene.
There are these people who come to Antioch. They are apparently, based upon the brief description here, diaspora Jews, and by virtue of the fact that they are from these interesting places, the island of Cyprus, Cyrene in North Africa, by virtue of that, they speak Greek. And they, on their own initiative, impelled by the Spirit, it says that they spoke to the Hellenists, or they spoke to the Greeks. And here this is no longer Greek-speaking Jews, this is Greeks. And presumably that occurs, Carl, in the context of the local synagogues. So presumably these are people who are still somewhat in the orbit of Judaism as proselytes to Judaism or as God-fearers, and so they take special interest in these Greeks, and they speak with them and share with them, and their ministry among them is blessed. And Luke, as he tells the story, points that out as something of an innovation that they have taken this step.
You know, it's interesting too because this is a surprise because these Greeks who are interested are those who actually were sparked by the persecution of Saul that have brought them to this location. And so this church begins to grow with these Gentile believers, and it seems like they recognize that the church as a whole recognizes that something needs to happen here, and word reaches the brethren in Jerusalem, and they're kind of surprised by this. And so they send Barnabas. Who is this man Barnabas, and What traits does he display that really makes him the right man for the right time for this situation in Antioch?
Well, I'm going to label Barnabas the Joseph of the New Testament. And the reason I do that is, most of the characters that are portrayed in the Bible are portrayed very realistically, warts and all. So we know their flaws and their faults and their failings. But occasionally we have these figures in the Bible that seem to be painted in idealistic tones. Joseph in the Old Testament, if you will, you have to search pretty hard to find a flaw, and then Barnabas, and every time he pops up, he's just exemplary in his behavior. He's an encourager, he's an equipper. Here we just see him in a most positive light. He first pops up, doesn't he? By giving his properties, he's liberal, so he's giving to his fellow believers, and then we see him with Paul and Saul, and now here he's, he could have just assumed the limelight of what was going on in Antioch, and he's in the mix. He's holding church meetings. He's connecting with them, I'm sure, and he's doing all of these things. And it might have been easy for him to say, hey, I'm going to soak this up. But that's not the kind of person he is. He somehow senses that there's a need in this new Antioch, I'm trying to come up with the adjective here, Antiochian church that he can't meet. That he's attuned to Saul and his gifts. And in his spirit, as the Lord speaks to him, he says, we really need Saul. And so he goes 130 miles, 8-day journey to go find Saul. And that's what a picture of someone who is humble, is working hard for the cause of God, knows that his own efforts need to be augmented by those of others. I just find this a really winsome picture of, this is the kind of person I want to be when I grow up. That kind of a portrait.
I think he is mentioned back, I think in Acts, is it 4 or 5, connected to the story of Ananias and Sapphira. And if I remember correctly, his name means the son of encouragement. And
yes.
And you see that here. That's just his gift. I mean, it defines who he is, and the fact that he would remember Saul of Tarsus. And there seems to be, if you do the chronology, there seems to be about a 6-year gap that's taken place between the last time we saw Saul, which is when Barnabas brought him and made that connection with the apostles in Acts chapter 9.
Yes.
And he just disappears for these 6 years, and could have, from a human point of view, faded into oblivion. But it's Barnabas who's like, there is that guy, that Saul, who has, we need someone who can speak the language of these Greek believers, these Greek seekers, someone who knows their culture, their way of life, but yet someone who knows the scriptures and is a committed follower of Jesus. And for him, that light just comes on. It's Paul, and he makes the journey, like you said, and brings Paul back, or still called Saul at this point in time, and he becomes the associate pastor, you might say, the Gentile pastor in the church in Antioch. And what a powerful ministry team, a duo, Paul and Barnabas become in that church. Now, we talked about personalities. There's another personality that shows up in the church in Antioch, and that's a prophet named Agabus. And he talks about, he predicts or tells the future that there's this coming disaster in Jerusalem. And that motivates the church to do a kind of a new ministry. Can you kind of talk about that ministry?
Yeah, let me just stay with Barnabas for just a moment, because he is just so impressive here. Saul, we've missed him. We've missed a segment. The 6-year gap is present there, but Barnabas, of course, knows his story, knows that he is now a seasoned missionary. He's worked in Damascus. We get these little hints. He's worked in Nabatea, probably in Petra. He's at this point a seasoned missionary Christian evangelist. And plus, he's a trained theologian, having trained at the feet of Gamaliel, the famous rabbi teacher. And so Barnabas treasures him for who he is, and what a great thing that is. But then, this as part of this, as part of a delegation of prophets who came from Jerusalem to Antioch, we have Agabus. And I find this little scene really interesting, Carl, because Agabus stands up and he gives a prophecy, and it's clearly says it's by the Spirit, and he prophesies that there would be a great famine over all the world. Well, that's a pretty bold prophecy. There is going to be a worldwide famine. Wow. And I'm touched and impressed by the response of the believers in Antioch to that bold prophecy. But there's also a timing issue here, and I know you've worked some on the chronology of these matters. There's a gap here, is there not, between when Agabus prophesies and when the famine actually occurs. And that's a span of time. Somewhere I read 10 years. Could that be true?
I've not heard 10 years. I thought it was a shorter time frame, but there is some discussion. The chronology issue is a tough one in the book of Acts, outside of key chapters where we know who the Roman governor is, like in Acts chapter 18, and Acts chapter 12 when we meet Herod Agrippa. But besides that, there is some flexibility in knowing exactly the timing is a question.
But God bless these believers. They obviously believe in this Agabus. They believe that he is a prophet and that he has a connection with the Spirit. And they hear his bold prophecy. And my temptation, I'm sitting there in those house churches in Antioch, would have been to say, wow, this is going to be interesting. Let's see if this happens. But that's not what they do. They begin a strategic famine relief initiative based on the prophecy of Agabus. I find that fascinating.
It's interesting in that you might think, because his prediction, his forecast is, as you said, for a worldwide famine, right? It's like a pandemic. I mean, it affects everything. But their response is not, let's kind of store up for ourselves, or kind of plan for the future here. But they see this as an opportunity to reach out to the mother church in Jerusalem. And to me, that's intriguing, because you could say, well, there's other churches elsewhere, but it's the mother church that they want to help. And I'm just curious if this famine relief visit that's going to take place when Paul and Barnabas go, that sounds very similar to what Paul later wants to do in his ministry, when he wants to raise a collection of funds to help the believers in Jerusalem around the year 57, 58, something like that. So we're talking, many years later now from this time. So there is this goodwill to the mother church, and I wonder if the church in Jerusalem, was it more needy because they were selling their property and giving to each other? Did they have greater needs, or was it because they were isolated and perhaps outcasts from traditional Jewish welfare, since they were Christians rather than non-believing Jews? So it's just an intriguing aspect that they would want to help the mother church.
It is intriguing, and I think you're right in at least suggesting that this outreach, this new initiative, this famine relief ministry, is what sparks Paul's interest. Now, I think it grows and develops over the years, and he reaches out to it as a strategy to actualize and illustrate the unity of the church. Because as we see in places like Ephesians chapter 2, he wants to see Gentiles and Jews on equal footing as partners in the church. And part of his way of communicating that that's a good thing to his co-religionists among the Jews is to say, look at these Gentile believers care about you and they are willing to sacrifice to meet your needs. And so he busies himself with this collection of the saints. I think it's one of the most underrated features of Paul's life and ministry, perhaps alongside with his preaching and work in the marketplace as a tent maker and so on, because by some accounts he spends years on this collection. And you'll remember that as we come to the end of the story in Acts, it's actually in another trip to Jerusalem to deliver a famine relief offering that he is arrested, and that all of the ending points of his story begin. So it begins with a prophet from Jerusalem going to Antioch, making a bold prediction, and those saints responding positively to that and saying, if that's true, and we believe it is, what should we do about it? And I find that a really inspiring example.
I think it is, and when I look at the book of Acts and try to connect it with other passages in Scripture, this famine relief visit, I believe, is the story that takes place in Galatians chapter 2, when Paul talks about going up to Jerusalem by revelation. I think that is connected to Agabus there, and that's the connection when he really seems to be able to get the affirmation of the church in Jerusalem. And at the end, they continue to remind him to please remember the poor. And so that's how I see that story fitting in, connected here to the story of Acts. Some people see Galatians chapter 2 as the Acts 15 visit, but I think it better fits here at the end of Acts chapter 11. But I should ask you, what lessons, what practical lessons are there for us today, perhaps, in this story connected to Agabus?
Well, I think there are a lot of good lessons here. We tend to approach the stories in Acts, I think, as mission stories and don't look to them for profound theology. But I think there are some really profound ideas and thought at work here. One that we shouldn't miss is the pervasive influence of the Spirit in this sketch. The Spirit is behind Barnabas and his work. The Spirit is inspiring Agabus with this bold prediction. The Spirit, though not explicitly mentioned, is certainly inspiring the response of the believers to that, and on and on and on. And so it leaves us with, I think, some fairly profound questions, Carl, about the Spirit in our midst. And it sends us to our knees praying, Lord, how can we in our day, in different circumstances, in the middle of a pandemic and so on, how can we be in submission to your Spirit, be listening to whatever messages the Spirit may have, either illuminating our own hearts or perhaps through leaders or through our fellow church members? How can we be as submissive to the Spirit and as attentive to Spirit-filled messages as these saints are in Antioch? That's a good place to start, I think.
Yeah, I think it is. And as I think about this story and the time and energy and effort and finances that were involved in that, it makes me think of the many good things that our local theology Sabbath school has done over the years. You and I, just a year ago now, hard to believe, we were in Pakistan, and some great needs there at the seminary, and need for solar powered electricity. And our Sabbath school class stepped up at great financial cost and reached out to help the brothers and sisters in Pakistan. And we've done that in many, many ways. And I know that it's not just here in our Sabbath school class that these things have taken place, but around our world, in other churches. And that's really, I think, the beauty of the fellowship, the family of God that reaches around the world, and where we can, share resources, share gifts, share abilities, and all of it is really for the glory of God's work. And we see that alive and well in the church in Antioch a church that really is, in my mind, the missionary church in the book of Acts.
Yeah, and in this moment in which we live right now, Carl, another aspect of the example of believers here, the saints, the believers from Cyprus and Cyrene, the saints who respond to Agabus, those under Barnabas's care, is their spirit of innovation. They could have responded in different ways, and they could have stayed with the tried and true and the ruts that had already been put in the ground by others going before them. But they're open to the Spirit, and they feel impelled toward innovation. And as a result, we have this impressive step of moving to not just sharing with Greek-speaking Jews, but sharing with Greek-speaking Greeks. And we have a new famine relief ministry. And these things, inspired by the Spirit, then prove to be very successful under the Spirit's continued superintendence. And so I think it becomes an invitation for us in this moment to be innovative. We need innovation. We need new ideas. And we need not to do those willy-nilly, but try to be attentive to what the Spirit is calling us to in this moment.
Yeah, powerful. And I think it goes back to that same very point you made at the very beginning, that Barnabas was willing to share that ministry. And I think that also calls us to have that willingness to share and invite others to come on board and to use their gifts and ability to spread God's word. Powerful stories in Acts chapter 11. Our time is running out, so we should kind of shift gears to chapter 12, which is also a fascinating story, a kind of a challenging story in relationship to Herod Agrippa, who becomes the king of Judea. And it starts with the death of James, the imprisonment of Peter. So some really difficult, challenging circumstances for that church in Jerusalem. But at the same time, there seems also to be some, do I dare say it, some comedy elements in this very serious and grim story. Maybe you can kind of highlight what we might see as kind of this comedy in these very difficult stories.
I've had the opportunity to study this story of Peter's rescue, and there's several really excellent recent scholarly articles in peer-reviewed journals that argue the case that there is significant humor buried here in this story. And if you take the time to really study that out, I think you'll probably join me in agreeing that's the case. Now, it is a little almost uncomfortable because this chapter starts with the grim story of Herod Agrippa I slaying James, right? And Peter is kind of chapter 2 of this. The James thing works out so well for him. His poll numbers go up, and everybody seems to respond very positively to this initiative he's taken in executing James. And so he says, okay, let's see, Peter, James, and John, the big three. Well, why not go after another one here? So he goes after Peter, and he schedules the execution of Peter. So it starts with this grim story of the execution of James, and then it ends with an equally grimy story in the death of Herod Agrippa I himself. And so that's why I've had to ponder long and hard to say, is there really comedy in between? And I think there is. So let me try to sketch it out. These peer-reviewed articles compare what's going on in this story with what's going on in the media of the day. Okay? And so they see here a couple of things. There is a motif in the humor of the time of a running slave. A slave who runs somehow sparks comedy in the time, a little bit like that famous scene in I Love Lucy where she's in the chocolate factory. You only have to flash a still of that on the screen, and we all laugh because we know how funny it is. And Luke flashes this scene of a running slave girl, Rhoda, on the screen, and everybody who knows the media at the time gets it. This is a laugh line. You know, this is comedy. And then there were also knock-knock jokes in the time. And Luke seems to structure this knocking at the gate a little like the knock-knock joke. And so you can make these kinds of arguments that there's some humor going on here. But the piece of it that really works for me, Carl, is this. Look at the story of how easy it is for Peter to get out of jail. I mean, it happens in your sleep. The manacles melt away. The guards are anesthetized. All the gates just swing. I mean, it is so easy to get out of jail. It is just as easy as can be. But then the comedy comes in the next scene. It is hard to get into church. So, you know, he's banging at the gate, he's calling out, he's trying to get in because the Lord has released him. And they're in there praying that the exalted Jesus will answer their prayer and rescue Peter. They're praying these earnest prayers. And then what becomes obvious, though, is that the belief in their hearts does not match the prayers on their lips, and they don't really think the risen, exalted Jesus is going to do it. And this juxtaposition of it's easy to get out of jail, but you can hardly get into church, I think is part of this comedy, and it becomes rather comedic then that these believers are praying so earnestly, yet they don't really believe that the exalted Jesus is actually going to act on their behalf, and they're willing to criticize this slave girl. They're willing to reach for an obtuse theological argument. Well, it must be his angel. It's really told in a lot of detail, and there's some humor there. But what joins the comedy of the story with the seriousness of its setting is that at some point we get it, that the joke is on us. The joke's on the believer, and the joke is on us. And we end up asking, how often does the high eloquence of our prayers meet an echo chamber of unbelief in our hearts? And it's that moment that the great comedy is like that. You know, the timing is right. You learn the joke's on you, and there comes this sober moment of self-reflection. And for me, that's the real power of this interesting story.
That's great. Yeah. You know, I've seen some of those I've seen elements of that comedy in the passage, but not quite told in that way. And I like that kind of key point at the end that the joke really is on us, and how true that is. We go through the motions, and yet we often don't believe that what we're asking for could really happen. You know, I think to heighten that element of humor in the story is the fact that even it names the number of soldiers that are there watching Peter, which is interesting because, you know, throughout the earlier chapters of the book of Acts, the early Christians keep getting out of jail, and Herod Agrippa's like, you know what, we know this track record, they're always getting out of here, we're going to double down, 16 soldiers, 4 at a time, a 6-hour shift, two soldiers at the gate, and 2 soldiers, one on the right, one on the left, and he's locked down. Yet none of those things are obstacles for God. And what an important lesson.
Yeah, it's a great story, and I should make it clear, Carl, that by saying that Paul may be borrowing from the media of his time, I'm not saying he's crafting a story and that this is a novel. This is in line with the discovery that has been happening now for decades, that these gospel authors are great storytellers. That Luke, as the author of Luke Acts, is a great storyteller. And so he doesn't just give you the bare facts, he tells the story in a very creative way based on those facts, sharing those facts that is intriguing and beautiful and wondrous. It's great literature.
It's beautiful. Now, I wonder if, there is a difficult question. We can talk about the comedy of the passage, but there really is a difficult question in the heart of this story. The Peter story is one that people know, they talk about, and it's amazing. God intervenes, he acts, he's there, he cares. But oftentimes we overlook the story of James. And, James loses his life. There's no get out of jail free card for James. And it seems like that's how we experience life too, that sometimes God seems so present and so powerful, and his hand is so visible, it's just beyond doubt. But at other times, we just don't see his hand. Any ideas? I know this is not an easy question. Any idea how we process two stories? God saves Peter, he doesn't save James.
I think that's an important part of this section of Acts. You have the death of James at the beginning of Acts 12, and then at the end there's a little note that perhaps we should notice as well. Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem, and they brought with them John, whose other name was Mark. So they bring John Mark with them, and you remember that they then form a missionary team, but it does not go well. That is, John Mark becomes the point of friction between Saul and Barnabas. So, not every missionary team works. Not every mission strategy works. And the Lord has there's a different end in mind for all of us. Sometimes that's rosy, sometimes it's not. And it brings us to Paul's own insight in Romans 8:28 that in all things God is at work. I don't know about your feeling on that passage. I prefer that translation to, God works everything. In a whole variety of circumstances, we have the privilege of trying to see God's hand at work, and some are much harder than others. The execution of James, for example. But in the light of eternity, we will be able to look back and to trace God's hand in all kinds of varied circumstances. His love and his grace for us, whether we're trying a missionary initiative, a new strategy that he has inspired, or one that's only of our own making that really doesn't have much merit. And we'll be able to praise him that in everything, in every circumstance, God was at work.
Yeah, that was powerful, beautiful, and I think just the reality, the truth, right, the organic nature of the Christian life. And at no point in time does that mean that somehow God loved Peter but didn't love James. And we don't know how God made his presence known to James in that moment of his arrest and eventual execution, but I'm confident God was with him, just like he's with us in the challenging parts of our lives as well. John, our time is just about up, but we have a few minutes left. Let's talk about the end of this story. It's the death of Herod. It takes actually place about 3 years later from the start of the story, so it's not an immediate sequence of events. Is this just a transition story, or might there be a deeper theological meaning connected to the story of the death of Herod Agrippa?
Well, some time ago I read a commentator who suggested, this is just a transition story. There's no real depth of meaning here, and it made me try to read the story more carefully. And I think there's deep theology here in this story of the death of Herod. I think it connects with the story back in chapter 5 of Ananias and Sapphira. And you'll remember that they tested the Spirit of the Lord, pretended that God actually didn't know their business, right? And it seems to me that Herod shares a common flaw with these two. He paints God out of the picture. His mute response to these citizens of Tyre and Sidon who see him in his shimmering robes. I'm thinking of the version of Josephus that describes this same scene. They see him in his shimmering robes, and they hear his speech, and they say, "Wow, this is the voice of a God." And the judgment really comes on him for a sin of omission, because it's not, he doesn't proclaim himself a God, but he fails to correct the situation. He writes God out of the formula. He paints God out of the picture. His mute response would be appropriate only if there were no God in heaven. And then there's the story of Simon the Sorcerer, who takes a bit of the same approach. And remember that people praised him. This man is the divine power known as the great power, Acts chapter 8, verse 10. And so if you join these stories together, there's something of a theme here, building here. With the story of Ananias and Sapphira and that of Simon the Sorcerer, Herod's death illustrates the wrong of failing to give God his due. And if one looks at the themes of the book of Acts, it could be strongly argued that Luke, the writer, sees this as no minor sin, but the worst of all. And we dare not write God out of the picture of our lives, even when that picture is focused on Bible study and ministry and things that are wondrous and good. We must always cede our domain to God and to Christ, and figure him into everything that we do.
Yeah, powerful. And I think the encouragement at the end, it certainly has as Luke sees it, I'm sure the believers saw it at their day, that in the end, all those wicked rulers who persecute and oppress God's people, their rule will come to an end. And we can look forward to the day when God will establish his kingdom, and he will become the one who sits upon the throne of this earth. Powerful stories in the book of Acts. John, our time is about up, but I'll give you one last chance here if you want to maybe say a little summary of the take-home for all these stories for us as we wrap things up here at the end.
In these stories, in Acts chapters 11 and 12, we see the hand of God at work amongst early Christian believers. We see innovative mission strategies being deployed and God blessing those strategies. We see a group of relatively new believers who are open to the Spirit of God, and they're listening and they're acting on the things that they hear from the Spirit. We see the exalted Jesus acting on behalf of believers, and here's the really good news. Even when they don't think he's going to do it, God's grace in our lives does not rest on our belief or the fervency of our faith. We need to be alert to God's graciousness and the way that in our unbelief he reaches out and blesses us and frees Peter and so on. There's some bad news in these stories about us, but there is powerful news about the heart-knowing, heart-cleansing God, referring to the Cornelius story, who God is. There's a great theology in these stories.
Wow, powerful. Dr. McVeigh, thank you for joining us again with Theology Sabbath School. I want to give a special thanks also to our cameraman today, Matthias Bernard, and our program director, Alex Paxa, who puts all these pieces together. And thank you to our viewers also for tuning in. May you find strength in the news of the risen, exalted Christ who can make that difference in our life today too. So take care, God bless. We'll see you next time as we look at Acts chapter 13 and 14. Take care, God bless. Bye-bye.